Hello friends, or maybe I should say hail liberators. I'm Thomas Waters and welcome to my video series on revolutions and the making of the modern world. This series is about the history of revolutions over the past 2.5 centuries. Today I'd like to introduce the history of a development that was peppered with revolutions. That development is decolonization, the process of rolling back the many frontiers of empire. In particular, I want to discuss the decolonization of the European empires roughly around the middle of the 20th century. In fact, I can only introduce some aspects of this big, complex topic which encompasses politics, economics, culture, demographics and more. Decolonization was fundamental to the history of the 20th century. What's more, the process is not entirely complete even now. It established many structures and dynamics that still heavily influence our lives today. So, for all decolonization's intricacies, it's important that we at least begin to try to understand it. The basic reason why decolonization is so vast and complex a topic is that empire too is extremely complex and varied. So complex that scholars of imperialism have developed two foundational concepts for distinguishing between different types of imperialism, and those concepts are formal and informal empire. Formal empire is where imperial sovereignty is acknowledged in flags, anthems, oaths of allegiance, administrative and constitutional structures. Informal empire, on the other hand, is where a nation exerts outsized influence over the conduct of another, though in a somewhat hidden way, without this being explicitly acknowledged or overtly symbolised. Both formal and informal empires have been constructed and held in place by a wide spectrum of power and influence. This includes military force, settler colonialism, and political alliances involving local divide and rule type collaborations. But empires are also established using economic relationships and, as well, cultures and ideologies justifying the whole enterprise, making it seem inevitable and perhaps even desirable. Decolonization entails resisting and rolling back all of these fronts or features. Europe's empires were dramatically torn apart in the colonies themselves. They were fatally undermined by independence struggles, from the civil disobedience led by Gandhi in India to the extremely violent struggle in Algeria before independence from France was won in 1962. The Indian Army could not fairly be expected to provide a reliable instrument for maintaining public order in conditions tantamount to civil war. So it was agreed in a 1946 meeting of the British Cabinet a year before independence and partition. Threatened or actual revolutions were key in bringing down both formal and informal colonial regimes across Asia and Africa, from Colonel Gamal Nasser's coup that deposed King Farouk of Egypt in 1952 to the Mau Mau rebellion in Kenya. Uprisings and rebellions in the colonies also helped to precipitate opposition to empire back in the imperial metropoles. The gains of empire had, after all, never been shared equally. Some classes, groups, factions and professions gained much. Others paid much, in money and in lives, for the upkeep. When colonial wars, insurgencies and rebellions made the cost of empire prohibitively high, the people, and sometimes the armed forces too, at home, rebelled. Notably, it was the high cost, both financial and personal, of military expenditure in Angola and Mozambique that helped to bring down Portugal's military dictatorship in 1974. The human scale of decolonization was vast. Between 1945 and 65, for instance, the number of people under British imperial rule fell from 700 million to just 5 million. Former settlers and others also made their ways back to Europe. 1.5 million arrived from French Algeria alone in the 1950s and early 1960s. However, these sorts of figures and movements could make us imagine that decolonization in the second half of the 20th century was far more complete than it actually was. For in many ways and places, some heavy legacies of empire persisted for decades, if not longer. In certain respects, they did so in Australia, New Zealand and Canada. These former British colonies of large-scale white settlement had been given special self-governing status within the British Empire. For this reason, they had a special name, Dominions. The British connection had a longer life than we might imagine. It's significant that Canada did not adopt its own anthem, O Canada, until 1980. Australia didn't replace God Save the Queen with Advance Australia Fair until 1984. You might call this ceremonial window dressing, not denoting, or at least not correlating with, substantial political change. But that would be wrong. The new flags and anthems symbolised important changes in the national character of the former dominions, including the development of distinctive national identities and a rejection of Britishness. It marked the end of the family of nations that could once have been described as Greater Britain. There were in fact attempts to revive Greater Britain after World War II. As part of this, between 1948 and 57, slightly over 1 million British emigrants went to the Dominions, many on assisted passage schemes. For its part, Australia didn't end the subsidised immigration of Britons until 1972, and the White Australia policy, formally devised in 1901, wasn't abolished until 1973. To varying degrees from Canada to New Zealand, British or white on top policies of internal colonisation, for which indigenous minorities paid the price, were enacted until quite late on in the 20th century. But though this white empire was rejuvenated somewhat after World War II, by the 1960s it was noticeably in decline and with its end in sight. The rise of both nationalism and civil rights, notably, ensured that by the 60s there was very little talk of pride in the British race as there had been in previous generations. A longer lasting legacy of empire was the creation of huge but elusive concentrations of multinational finance and capital. Decolonization created a money panic of sorts, where colonial assets were rapidly liquidated and funk money, as it was known at the time in English, fled from the threats of higher taxation, if not outright nationalisation. Under most colonial regimes, taxes fell primarily on imports and on native peoples, while foreign settlers paid little or nothing directly. With this system about to end, finance fled. Much of the money was moved not to the metropoles of empire, but to tax havens, with little or no tax and powerful secrecy regimes protecting various individuals and shell companies from having to share their enormous wealth with the populations either of the former colonies or the former imperial states. Switzerland, Monaco, Gibraltar, the Bahamas, Malta, the Channel Islands, and many more gained huge boosts in the dying days of empire. It wasn't just colonial money, but people too that moved there, looking for milder climates and low taxes. This capital and people flight didn't just harm metropoles like London and Paris, who certainly could have used the tax revenue. The effect was greater on the former colonies, particularly after post-colonial elites also began in many places availing themselves of the same murky wealth shelters. Fortunes made in Sudan, the Congo, Egypt, Argentina, China and elsewhere continued to go abroad. The long-term effects in the West and globally were massive. Decolonization helped to establish the institutions, moral climates and economic paradigms that allowed for the rise of basically tax-free multinational corporations. It also helped to usher in the highly financialized economy, predatory capital and extreme divisions of wealth that we are living with today. As the Berkeley historian Vanessa Ogle puts it, decolonization was an economic and financial event of the first order, one which laid the foundations for the neoliberal economic paradigm that's become so ascendant since the 1970s.